You're listening to After Images, a podcast for cinephiles that takes a deep dive into moving images. Each episode features a special guest who is invited to explore a film of their choice. After Images is hosted by film writers Frank Bouleg and Marisa C. Hayes.
Today's episode features a discussion with author Amber Sparks about Alice, Jan Švankmajer's first feature-length film. Alice is the artist's take on Lewis Carroll's first Alice book, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Released in 1988, the film combines live action and stop-motion animation. As in Švankmajer's other films, Alice is a powerful surrealist work of art that plunges the young protagonist and the viewer into a dream where nonsense and dark undercurrents feed the narrative, whether or not we manage to keep our head intact until the closing credits.
Amber Sparks is the author of an upcoming novel, Happy People Don't Live Here, and 4 collections of short fiction, including And I Do Not Forgive You, Revenges and Other Stories, and The Unfinished World. Her fiction and essays have appeared in American Short Fiction, The Paris Review, Slate, Tin House, Granta, The Cut, and elsewhere. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband, daughter, and 2 cats.
Amber Sparks, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to After Images podcast.
Hello, it's lovely to be here.
We are really looking forward to discussing Jan Švankmajer's Alice with you. And we always like to begin by asking our guests, why did you choose this film and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I actually chose the film because it does have sort of a special meaning to me. I watched it for the first time when it was on Criterion, I think, during the pandemic. And I watched it with my daughter. I was desperate for things to watch with her. She's 8 now, but at the time, I think she was like 4. And I had sort of exhausted all of the usual options and was getting into like the really wretched, awful children's fare that I couldn't bear to watch as a film person. And so, I think Criterion had this animated sort of a theme or whatever. And I found Alice and I said, oh, well, Alice in Wonderland, that's great. We all love Alice. And I do. Going back many years, I've had a love affair with Alice and that story. But in this case, I thought, well, I will watch this with my daughter because obviously it's appropriate for children. And it was funny because I watched it and it is, I think, very appropriate for children. Perhaps not all children, but my daughter is, her nickname's Wednesday Addams. She's a certain sensibility that it worked very well for her. Actually, she preferred it to all of the more sort of saccharine Alice interpretations that she's seen. And it's got this very, mischievous, anarchic quality to it that none of the other adaptations have. And I had never seen anything by Jan Švankmajer, and I was like, what is this? What have I read? This is amazing. And so I'm going to use a terrible metaphor here, but I went down a rabbit hole after that of, Czech animation and sort of stop motion animation and the Brothers Quay and all of these things that even though I'm a longtime film buff, I had never actually encountered really, or just encountered here and there, but never really in a systematic way. So Alice was sort of the start of all of that. And I really got into a lot of that during the pandemic and found it a really wonderful distraction, frankly. And it's very funny because Alice is now my daughter's favorite movie, she will tell you. And of course, all her friends, they're like, oh, yeah, I've seen that movie too. And I'm like, it's fine. Just don't tell them which one it is.
And what is it you think that attracted your daughter's attention to the film? Is it the dark tones of the film, or is it the dreamy aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, both. I think I read that I was reading up on the film afterwards, and Schwankmeyer's sort of approach to it, and I read that he approached it as a dream, and that's what he loved about. He wanted to take on this subject that he didn't see it as this sort of moral tale, which so many people have interpreted as. He saw it as much more dreamlike. And I think children, actually, I don't think it would just be my daughter. Like, I feel like this children in general would love that version, because it does. Children have that very um anarchic, very sort of chaotic version of, or vision, excuse me, of life, and as things that are dreamlike and very surreal in a lot of ways, and they actually love that and accept that, I think, a lot more than adults tend to. It's just sort of second nature. Adults are like, why are there socks, and why are they moving in and out of the floor? And my daughter's like, that's great, I love that. uh, She's not like questioning why would the filmmaker make that choice. She's just like, well, of course. Um, and so I actually think in some ways she loved that. She loved the dark tones as well. It has that sense. I think of like Bruno Bettelheim and this sort of idea of children being very dark people in many ways, and or having this sort of wicked streak. The Roald Dahl children, which children, I think, generally tend to love those characters and be drawn to them because they do have a bit of a sense uh, of um, of meanness inside of them, or the ability to sort of have that meanness, particularly when it comes to adults, right, and dealing with adults. So I think she was sort of drawn to all of that.
I love that. That makes so much sense too, to think that, we don't expect life to make sense, especially when we're young, that we just accept these kind of absurdities. But I was also thinking that even though I never had the good fortune to watch this film when I was young, I discovered it as a young adult. I imagine that children would also really relate to the title character being the main focus of the film and everything being shown from her perspective. She has so much agency, I think, in terms of like, we don't even see older sister Dinah's face in the beginning. Everything is really focused on Alice and kind of the absurdity of the adult world, and more the things that make sense to her in that dreamlike space. I'm just wondering if your daughter also said anything about the character of Alice, or the fact that there was this young actress who carries the entire film.
Yeah, yeah, no, she did. She It's funny because we watched the Alice in Wonderland, the Disney version, like 100 times or whatever, and she never particularly identified with Alice, or was attracted to that character in any way. And it wasn't really until she saw this version that all of a sudden she decided she wanted to dress like Alice. She demanded that I go out and get her a little dress, and like white socks, and it was very funny. And I think she called it her British child uh, style. She said, "I want to be like a little British child." Like, well, I don't think that's what they look like nowadays, but that's fine. Yeah, so she did, but she did very much, I think. She didn't necessarily articulate why, but I think she did identify with that character sort of for the first time, probably because of that perspective. And because she's not so saccharine and sweet, right? And I know in the Disney version, there's sort of moments where she steps out of being this sort of sweet character, but for the most part, it's this very moralistic sort of frame that Disney popped onto it, as opposed to there's no sense of that. I think kids can probably relate much more to the way that Alice moves through this dream world, that the young girl moves through this dream world in the new one, or not the new one, but the Schwankmeyer one.
I think it's all very interesting because we were discussing before this conversation the fact that at the beginning of the film, there's a statement that the film is for children. And I was wondering, I mean, to what extent is that real? Because, I mean, it is dreamy, but it is also a bit nightmarish at moments. And I was wondering how they could relate to that. What you're saying is interesting because it shows that children are not yet formatted to like a certain type of story, a certain type of storytelling, and that they are actually more open than what we think they are to new forms of art and to new forms of storytelling, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've definitely found that to be true with my daughter. And it's surprising to me even the things that she will be scared of or that will be more intriguing than scary. Some of the things that happen in this film are very nightmarish, right? There's a scene where the lizard guy gets killed or whatever, and then sort of comes back to life, and then all the toys kind of come back to life and try to chase Alice, and she turns into a creepy doll at several points, and there's things that to adults, right, it comes off as very nightmarish and horrific, but my daughter was not afraid of any of those parts. Particularly, they were just very intriguing. And it was actually interesting, even the way that I would say, so she first saw the film when she was about 4.5, and then saw it again more recently because we watched it together before I was going to do this podcast. And the parts that scared her this time were more parts that would, I think, be a little scarier to a grown-up. Already, even at 8.5, she had sort of that part of her brain that told her, oh, this is what to expect and not to expect in a film, had suddenly developed. And then she did sort of find the Bill part scary, and the idea of turning into a doll was creepy, whereas it was not creepy at all when she was 4.5. It was just fascinating. Like, what if I turned into a doll? That would be really interesting.
Mm.
A thought experiment, right? And then by the time she's 8.5, suddenly that has already become sort of a nightmarish prospect.
Mm.
It's been interesting to see. I've been long very fascinated by surrealism, both in film and in fiction. And actually art too. That's sort of my subject. And so my poor child has been this unwilling participant in being exposed to a lot of surrealist imagery. Um, in film and art and everything, but it's been really interesting to actually even watch how her vision of the surreal sort of changes as she gets older.
Well, I know we want to come back to the subject of surrealism and writing, and for sure talk to you about your own work in writing and how that might relate. But just to jump on the idea of surrealism in this film in particular, and I know you mentioned that you've also been watching a lot of Czech animation recently. I was thinking about this kind of hybrid mix of object and live action that we see, and just how responsible is that for this kind of surrealist effect, the kind of enchantment that we get from watching this film.
Yeah, I think it's very much responsible for that effect. I think I was just thinking watching this again, how there's so few films that really make use of more than one visual medium, and how jarring and interesting it is, right? There's I can think of, especially in American film, I can think of very few. There was this sort of period where you had Jim Henson. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, right? There was sort of this explosion of, I would say, more experimental approaches to animation. You had like the rotoscope thing, and you had the Jim Henson and the puppets, and you had sort of this cutout animation, right? They do sort of like in Yellow Submarine and some of the Monty Python films and things like that. But I feel like that, and actually even stop motion, right? And Ray Harryhausen, for example, the sort of 70s and 80s films that used actors and live action and these stop motion monsters. Um, and I think it was such an interesting time because they were just like throwing things at the wall to see what stuck, and it created this really bizarre juxtaposition in many of the movies that I don't even think was intended necessarily. Like when you watch, like, the Jason movies or the Sinbad movies. I don't think they were supposed to be particularly art films in any sense, but sometimes they take on this very interesting surreal aspect, just because you have these claymation stop motion skeletons dancing in this front of this very painted backdrop, and it's just the weirdest thing watching it now. So I definitely think the objects in the actual live action combined with the stop motion and some of these other mediums and the cut pieces too, right? There's the playing cards and sort of the 2D cutout figures that also figure into the story. So there's the objects, there's the live action, like human character, which I think is just Alice, I believe. And then there's also these like 2D figures, as well as sort of like the puppets and some of the more 3D figures, or live action-ish figures. So yeah, it is a really interesting mishmash of stuff, and I think it all sort of combines to have this very unsettling effect, because you don't quite know where you are in reality, or which world you're supposed to have one foot in, and where you are and things. And just like in the actual, like, it's very similar to the actual book in many ways. I think it gets the closest to the original Alice book, because that is very dreamlike, and you are constantly stepping from one environment into a completely different environment, where it's not just that suddenly you're in a garden and you were talking to a caterpillar. It's more that uh, the rules have all changed, right? Suddenly everything is different about that environment, and suddenly now you're a doll, and now you're not just shrunken. The way that you actually are able to interact with the environment around you is completely different. So I find that it sort of keeps you unsettled throughout the entire film.
That's such a good point. And it reminds me too that all of these different techniques and the kind of diversity of art objects that you find with these stop motion films in particular, it feels a bit like a buffet in terms of having all these different variety of visual representations that can give you that kind of emotional effect, to really experience a variety of feelings and sensations as you're watching. And it makes me a little sad that so many audiences today would sort of chuckle at these techniques because they're a bit antiquated, or because you don't have the same kind of continuity that you would have with certain special effects in more commercial films. And I'm so glad that someone like your daughter is lucky enough to get this good start in life to go back and start to look at some older classics and have that more an exposure to the diversity of filmmaking techniques and styles. I think that's so important. And I'm sure as a writer, you would agree how absurd it would be if we said that there's only one voice with which you could write. You
Yeah.
wouldn't have diversity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I do feel like I sense that there's a pushback happening now, and it feels like there's just a reaction to this sort of I don't know, flattening, which sounds like the wrong word, but the flattening of animation in general. Their Pixar look sort of took over for a long time, and everybody was trying to make the same kind of thing. These like sort of bouncy, round, 3D, characters. And I think, and also just the idea of everything being CGI, right? And no practical effects. And for a long time, it was sort of, you'd watch these Ray Harryhausen movies, and people would sort of make fun of them and be like, "Oh, doesn't this look silly? And how stupid! This dinosaur doesn't look like a real dinosaur." And didn't understand sort of that wasn't really the point, that it wasn't that they were trying to make something that looked 100% real. They were trying to depict something in film in some way that would make you feel something. And I think there's been enough sort of exposure to this flattening effect that CGI and the sameness of animation has really had, to the point where a lot of people are, I think, starting to try to do something a little different. I mean, you have Miyazaki coming out of retirement to, with his hand-drawn style, ranting and raving against his son, doing the the 3D bandwagon, joining the CGI bandwagon, and you have that's and I cannot remember their name. I feel so bad, but the Irish studio that did like Wolfwalkers and Secret of Kells.
Yeah.
The Book of Kells. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And Song of the Sea, which are beautiful films and really interesting to look at. And like Guillermo del Toro had his stop motion Pinocchio, which was had some issues as a film, I thought, but it was trying, and that was cool. The style was really interesting. And so I do think that there is, even like Coraline, right? And Corpse Bride and some of those films. I mean, I know they use some computer animation as well as just the stop motion, but sort of, I do see people sort of going back to that a little bit more and realizing, I think, that there was something there that was interesting, and that we're all sort of tired of these CGI fests and this same sort of animation, and maybe people want a different way to see something. So
I do agree with you when you said that there's a certain feeling by some people that stop motion is basically for children, when actually I think I mean, it's so much more than that. I mean, yes, it can be for children, but at the same time, and this is very interesting to analyze Alice through the eyes of a child, because children are trying to figure out the rules of the world. And so for them, a box can talk. I mean, who says it can't? I mean, until you've figured out that they don't actually, in our reality, do that, who says that objects have the right to have a life of their own? And I think this is what is so powerful about stop motion. Maybe it's the fact that all of a sudden all those objects are given back the life that we thought they could have when we were children.
yeah, no, I think that's beautifully put. I love that. I think that's exactly right. That's one of the things that I find most interesting about a lot of surrealist art in general. That's, for instance, the art of like Remedios Varo or Leonora Carrington. Objects have life. There are all these objects that have that are growing, or tables that suddenly have actual legs, or are growing sort of plants out of the heads of dressers, and boxes have mouths, and I think that's very true here as well. I think, and that's, you see that throughout Švankmajer's stuff, right? Is it objects have life, and all of these different objects sort of come to life in a way that is uh, not necessarily only there for the benefit of entertaining children. It can sometimes be frightening or unsettling, or but they're not there just for us. They actually have their own sort of sense of life, which is often very alien, right? It doesn't actually make any sense in terms of a human ideas and emotions, which is, I think, very cool.
Maybe we can segue a little bit into writing as well, because we have your wonderful book, and I do not forgive you here.
The great cover. I love that cover.
It'd be interesting to hear, perhaps first, what your relationship is to Lewis Carroll's writing, and how that may have influenced you as a writer.
Because there's
Yeah.
one of the short stories is titled "Through the Looking Glass," isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, Alice has haunted my writing for my entire life, I think, or as long as I can remember. I remember seeing it when I was too small to even remember, and like probably a lot of children, and immediately being taken with the idea of the unsettling, destabilizing aspect of it. I love that, and I've always, I think, been sort of obsessed with that in my writing. And I remember seeing on TV, actually, in the 1980s, there was this TV version of Through the Looking Glass, and I had read Alice, but I hadn't read Through the Looking Glass. And I read it after I saw the TV show, but it was, they had the chessboard and the queens and all of that. And I was very taken with this idea that there was a world behind this. She'd just step into the mirror, right, into a different world. That even seemed to me more exciting in some ways than than the idea of falling asleep on a riverbank, because that was obviously a dream, but then being able to actually step into a mirror sort of gave it a more surreal aspect. Is this real or is it not? We don't know. So yeah, and then I have a lot of stories that have echoes or shades of Alice in some way, even just in small ways. So the Through the Looking Glass is one. I actually, in my novel, actually, I have a novel that is coming out in 2025, early 2025. And it's, the main character's name is Alice. And it's not very much about Alice, but there are some callbacks, a few callbacks. Her entire family is obsessed with miniatures, and small things, dollhouses and things. So there's always just pieces of that. I think there's just so much to play with in the Alice story, for writers, for filmmakers, for whoever, that there are aspects that everyone's drawn to, I think. I actually took an interesting course, again, during the pandemic, lots of free time, sort of. And I took a course with somebody that was actually about Alice. It was like Alice and surrealism or something like that. I forget. And it was just like a little 5-week course. And one of the things we had to do was everybody had to pick the character that you sort of saw as a totemic figure, or as something that you were particularly drawn to in Alice. And that was very interesting, because everything, it means something different to everybody, right?
Are
It's
we
a
allowed for you? Was it Alice or was it someone else?
I can't actually remember who I picked. I don't, wasn't a caterpillar. Oh, I think it was the White Queen. I think that was who I ended up picking. But it's, different at different times, I would say. Often Alice as well, most of the time. But yeah, it was interesting because it's symbols, right? It's all symbols, and so that what you do with it can be really a huge variety. And the riffs are sort of endless, which is nice. I mean, that's even not to go back to Švankmajer for a second, but his I think the title of the film, and I am not even going to try to say it in Czech, but it's something, I think it's something of Alice is how it translates. So it's not the Alice story. It's not Alice as it's sort of popularly translated. It's actually something of Alice, which to me is a riff on the Alice story.
I thought that was really interesting too, that the original Czech title seems a lot more potent somehow than just simply Alice, especially because the young girl who plays Alice and who kind of introduces each section with a close up on her mouth as she's speaking a bit of dialogue, because there's not a whole lot of dialogue in the film, but we have this kind of narrative intro to each section. And I think it's reusing that formulation, if I'm not mistaken, from the subtitle translation that Alice thought. And it's kind of coming from her interiority. So that's, exactly like what you're saying.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the rest of his filmography? Have you seen other films by Švankmajer?
I have now. I had not at the time, but then I went back and I haven't seen them all yet. Some are hard to find, but I've seen a bunch, including like Little Otik, which I did not show to my daughter. This might be a little too scary.
It always reminds me of The Log Lady, personally.
Yeah, no, totally. And I love that sort of folk horror that it evokes. So that was really cool. But yeah, that and like Faust and some of the shorter films as well, the Jabberwocky and the dialogues and some of those. So yeah, but I'm still I was looking at my list today and I was like, oh, I still have a lot of these I need to find and watch. So it was very funny. I had a real fail of parenting where I got the Brothers Quay set with all of their films, their short films, because I thought, oh well, if she likes Alice, maybe she'll like these. And so we watched the Street of Crocodiles and some others, and she was like, what the fuck No, thank you. I'm bored out of my mind. I'm like, she watched like a couple and she was game, but she was like, yeah, no, bye.
So we're gonna work
So
on that
I love,
5.
But
yeah.
this is what's sort of amazing with Švankmajer is that it remains very, I mean, it's very abstract, very surreal, but it is very engaging at the same time. I'm always impressed by how sharp his editing and framings are. I mean, it's like a clockwork. And it draws you inside the story. It doesn't leave you outside.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I love the idea that there's sort of this, you get to see the inner workings.
Mm.
It's very meta, right? It's always very meta. Going back to writing, there's this sense of the story within a story always. Whether it's the, puppets, or it's somebody looking through a looking glass, or it's the stage, right? Whatever you're sort of seeing. And then, there's wind up dolls, and there's strings, and there's scissors cutting out things. And there's this always sort of this sense of things working, or seeing the actual like production itself, as well as the sort of the story around it. So it's got all these layers.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Earlier on, you said that even before starting to watch the films of Švankmajer, you were already a film buff. What sort of films are you into?
So many. That's a hard question to answer, but I would say, let's see, what do I especially love? Probably horror films in particular. That's just my favorite genre always. My husband and I are both very into horror, and so October in our house is like, that's all we do. That's for the entire month. And actually we're still kind of finishing up some films now, but and so my daughter's been indoctrinated into that as well. Which might have a little bit to do with the Wednesday Addams thing. But yeah, I classic films in particular, classic horror, universal horror. I almost chose for this Val Lewton, to talk about Val Lewton, because I have a great love for Val Lewton's films. And I was actually just talking to somebody else about The Seventh Victim the other day. I love spaghetti westerns. I love noir. There's so many. Just everything. I'm a huge film buff.
Yes, you're obviously a really have a wide range of cinephile interests.
Yes.
You know, are there concrete examples of how that manifests in your writing process? Just as I imagine there are many books that were influential for you, like Lewis Carroll's writing. What about film? How does that relate to your own writing practice?
Yeah, I think quite a bit. I definitely am a visual writer, and oftentimes setting is actually more important in my stories, in my writing, than plot. It probably is. I am always thinking very visually when I am writing, and I'm always thinking about sort of the not just the setting, but the visual tone of what I'm writing as well. So I do think a lot in terms of sort of a cinematic way when I'm writing. I think that's only gotten crazier as I've gotten older, and just been exposed to more and more interesting things. As soon as when I was a kid in college, like taking my film classes and suddenly being overloaded with these things that I'd never seen before, these amazing films. I was It sort of spurred a whole new kind of writing, in a much more, I think, surrealist style in a lot of ways. Um, and so yeah, I think it's a big influence, and it's sort of also an influence in the sense that I get this somewhat obsessive personality, and when it comes to consuming media, and so I will get into these, like, I don't know, moods, whatever, where I there's something that I'm just going to consume obsessively, watch obsessively, and Like, for instance, I went through a phase where I was just like, I was like, I'm going to watch and rewatch every David Lynch film and television show. And so then that also will really affect the writing that I'm doing during that period for fairly obvious reasons. So yeah, it is definitely, I think I go back and forth. I actually, at one time, I did want to be a film director. My original training is actually in acting and directing. That was what I went to school for, and I was going to go to film school and do all that jazz. And then I sort of chose this other path, but it's still always there, and I still am thinking a lot in terms of the interplay between art and film and writing on the page.
That's so interesting to hear about the different kind of thematic film cycles or director cycles that you go through, because it sounds almost like an important part of your practice in terms of, you say that that definitely influences your writing. And I can imagine that when you finish a story or a novel that you might recall what you were watching at that time or how its
Yeah.
tone played out.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm a very embarrassing sort of writer in the sense that, like, I'm like, I will have conversations with people and they're just like, I just sit down and write. And I'm like, wow, I have to listen to this particular kind of music and only watch these particular kind of films. And I've also been, going to the art museum to see very specific exhibits about X, Y, and Z, and only reading these types of books. And it's like, oh my God, it's a very different kind of practice that sometimes kind of seems very over the top. But I do think the only way that I can write is having this almost obsessive idea of tone and texture, and that is its own thing. A lot of what I write is probably, I would say, gothic or gothic influenced in some way, and that's all tone, right? It's so, I think that for me, just surrounding myself with all of this media, that all of this visual media that reflects that tone, just helps me to sort of keep it in my head and create it. It's like my version of being a method actor. Not really. I know that's not really being a method actor, but
It's like
yeah.
you're rating a certain atmosphere that you want to really
Yeah,
Mm.
method writing. Yes.
And can you tell us a little more about that upcoming novel of yours?
Yeah. So it is called Happy People Don't Live Here. Lovely, charming title. And it is, but it's funny, I think, I hope. I think it's funny, in a dark way. It is actually a sort of modern Gothic novel. I think that's what the jacket copy says. Um, and it's about a mother, Alice, and her daughter, Fern, who live in this sort of crumbling old sanitarium that is now an apartment building where a lot of people go to hide. And there's a lot of secrets, and there are ghosts, real ghosts, as well as metaphorical ghosts. And lots of strange things happen, including a mystery and a dead body. So, yeah.
Rabbit?
No rabbits, but there are rabbit holes. Yeah.
It definitely sounds very Schwankmajerian, if we can, if that's a term. And I'm just wondering if you could tell our listeners, and particularly in this day and age when a lot of younger people aren't really, or so I'm told, because I can't count myself among them anymore, they're not necessarily going back and looking at older films that are more than 5 to 10 years old. What would you give as an enticing reason for someone to discover Schwankmayer's Alice?
Yeah. I know, isn't that this like depresses me so much, because I still I remember being in college and being young, because I am no longer young, but I once was, and I remember like wanting to get into those old films, and that was sort of this mark of sophistication, if you know, that you could go back and you would watch these, you know, very artsy films and feel very cool because you discovered them. And so it's just crazy to me that like that's not a thing anymore, or that, you know, young people don't want to do that anymore. But I I think, I mean, a couple things. I have a couple thoughts on this. I think that people are introduced to a lot of films in the wrong way, or the wrong films. And for example, if you're trying to get your kid really into black and white films, older films, you know, maybe there are some things that are not going to be enticing to them. But like for example, we actually started, my daughter and I started watching, and my husband, the Marx Brothers. And we watched Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin films. And like, I feel like most people would say, oh my God, you can't expose an 8-year-old to silent film. But she loved it. And I've talked to other friends whose children have also, you know, watched silent film and loved it because it's pure physical comedy. It's the best thing for kids, right? That like, there's nothing they like better than like slapstick. Um, and suddenly it helps them sort of get over that hump of I'm watching something that's very old, or I'm watching something that isn't familiar to me, and it's black and white, and that's weird, and I don't know what I'm seeing because it's paced differently. They sort of get over all of that because they realize, oh, this can also make me laugh, and it is very funny, and I am enjoying watching it. And suddenly there's not this sort of stigma about black and white movies or whatever. So I feel like that's one thing, is just finding the movie that works for you as sort of an entry point. But but I don't even think that's a problem with Alice, because Alice is not even an older silent film or a black and white film or something that would be like quote unquote inaccessible in some ways. I feel like right off the bat, it feels very modern to me. It feels, I mean, first of all, in my head, I'm like 1988, that was like yesterday, right? But sadly, it was not. Um, but it feels modern to me. It does not feel like an older film. It's both in this sort of experimental aspect, but and the, I guess, metafictional way that it's told, but also just the imagery and the pacing and everything actually feels very modern. So but I feel like also uh like I always tell to when I'm teaching younger students, give it like 10 minutes. Give it 10 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever. And then, you know, do what you will after that. But if you give it 15 minutes, I guarantee you're gonna get sucked in. And you may not know exactly what you're watching, but you will be intrigued. And sometimes that's better than knowing, oh, it's this kind of movie, and now here's what I'm in for, right? And sometimes that's actually what we need right now most, is something that we have no familiarity with and that is absolutely intriguing just the same.
Absolutely. Great advice. Mhm.
No, and I think this relates back to also what we were saying earlier concerning children not yet having been taught what to like and what to dislike. I mean, they are very open to silent films, to black and white, to all sorts of filmmaking, because for them it's all new.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is no sense. It was funny because again, you see it when I see my daughter aging and actually having more of these preconceived notions as she gets a little bit older. Like when she was young, we would show her, I mean, we showed her like Buster Keaton films or whatever when she was like 3 and 4, because it's just like physical language for the most part. There's not much more that you need to bring to it. And she didn't think anything of it. She was just like, ah, this is funny. And then, you know, fast forward to now, and she's like, oh, well, I don't want to watch a black and white movie. And then, you know, once you put it on and she gets into it, she's like, oh, this is great. I love this. But then all of a sudden she has this idea in her head already. And I'm like, I don't even know where you got this from. Like, what, the kids at school? You're like, I don't want to watch a black and white movie. And like, So I think, yeah, there is this really wonderful opportunity when kids are very young and they don't have these preconceived notions and they aren't sort of being influenced in any way. They just are completely, as you say, completely open to anything and everything that's put in front of them. And surrealism is actually the most cool thing for those kids to watch because they just go with it. The whole world is surreal to them. Like, so of course they're gonna go with it.
Are there other animation projects, Czech films or otherwise from other nations that you would recommend to viewers who really appreciate Schwankmeyer? Of course, we mentioned the brothers Quay who pay tribute to Schwankmeyer and really appreciate his work, but any other animators from Central Europe that you might recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, I really liked Carol Siemens films. And that was another one we watched a bunch of those with my daughter as well, and she really enjoyed them. So they work really well for kids. The sort of bizarre combination of live action and like illustration was really, really interesting. Thinking what else? I mentioned the Brothers Quay, the who else? Oh God, I'm gonna butcher this name. I think it's Jerzy Trinka,
Mhm.
who did The Hand and some other stop motion puppet films, which are really, really cool. This one's Fantastic Planet, of course, which is I think a French and Czech collaboration. But that one actually, and it's funny, I was talking to my husband about this podcast and he was like, oh, that reminds me, we got to watch Fantastic Planet with our daughter. So I think we might actually do that tonight. Um, so yeah, that was so I love those, and of course I love a lot of stuff, the old like Ray Harryhausen films and things like that. I feel like if people haven't seen those, like they really should go back and watch because they're so much fun. Um and there's some more recent ones, obviously, like Anomalisa was really good. Anomalisa, Wolf House, I really loved also, and I can't remember the name of the animator, but I watched that recently. I'm not gonna watch that with my daughter, but if you've seen it, you don't know why, but it's not really appropriate for children. But it was wild. Oh my God, that was super interesting. Uh, so I do feel like I'm trying to keep an eye on things now because I do feel like there's new things that are popping all the time that stop motion is. I don't know if it's like coming back, but it's making more of an appearance here and there again, which is really cool. I think probably part of that is uh, the ability to sort of combine it with computer animation in a way that makes it a little bit less painstaking to do some of that work. But I think it's really cool. So yeah, love them too.
You might like to try to find the films of Ladislav Starevich too, who did a lot of stop motion in the 30s and 40s. I think he was Polish Russian, but worked in France for a long time. And they are very, very interesting, working with insects and also with puppets. They are, quite strange, but very powerful.
Cool. I'll check to check that out. And that's early too, in the 30s. That's interesting.
It's really beautiful work. But it's interesting what you mentioned too about the processes changing because, yeah, I think we should mention this very laborious process of stop motion and the time and dedication that went into that traditional process. I think I was reading that just to make, 1 minute of film, sometimes certain animators would spend several days on that process. So, yeah, it is interesting to know that today it's possible with merging some other techniques that simplify the process or speed it up in any case.
Yeah. I did think it was really interesting because I was reading that um one of the reasons that stop motion or that animation sort of in general fell off in the Czech Republic was that they actually didn't have the money and the sort of expertise to move into the computer animation phase, when everything went computer animation in the 90s and on, that they couldn't really compete. And that was so fascinating to me, because at the same, like they are doing these like incredibly laborious things with stop motion and hand drawn, but I guess that, maybe doesn't cost as much either. So
Yeah, it really is. Really helps us to remember too how much economy and technology are tied to the filmmaking process. As much as we love to talk about the artistic angle and that remaining the heart and soul, there are these kind of, realities that play into how things are made and when they get made.
yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that I know that the Pinocchio, Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, got a lot of attention and won some awards and things, and so I'm hoping that that will, maybe maybe at least start a tiny renaissance.
With people like Wes Anderson too.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I forgot about Wes Anderson. Yes, exactly. Fantastic Mr. Fox is so great. And what was the other one he did recently? I can't remember the name of it, but
Island of Dogs.
Island of Dogs. Yeah, which was really interesting. Um, so yeah, I love his stuff too.
So we usually like to close the podcast by asking our guests if there's a question that we haven't asked that they would have liked us. You wish we had asked.
Oh my goodness. I don't know. What about who's my favorite visual artist?
Okay.
Who's your favorite visual artist?
Remedios Varo. That everything that I've talked about here today is reflected very much in her work. The sort of life of objects, the surrealism, the symbols, the agency of female characters, all of that. So
Oh, she's such a powerful figure. I hope that if our listeners are not familiar with her work, that they will look her up to see some of the most stunning paintings that are out there.
if they're anywhere near Chicago, there is an amazing exhibit right now at, I think, the Art Institute that is features a whole bunch of her paintings that typically I think are only in Mexico. So I have not gotten to see it yet, but I hope that I can.
Well, we really enjoyed today hearing about your experience of Švankmajer's Alice, but also the unexpected surprise of hearing about the perspective of your young daughter and her experience of viewing it. I don't think we've ever really discussed on the podcast before how film affects children and what a young spectator would experience. So it was really interesting for us to have that angle today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I'm definitely trying to create a film junkie with all of my being. So
We hope she will continue to watch Švankmajer's movies and other stop motion films from the Czech Republic and other places around the world, because there's really a fascinating universe that can be that is created by all these artists, and that sometimes is a bit forgotten, looked over.
yeah.
It really deserves to be brought to the attention of the audiences.
I totally agree. I think it was I was really happy when Criterion did this whole theme around animation. I think it was I think it was even stop motion animation, I believe. Or maybe not. Maybe it was just I think it was just animation. But it was all of these things that I think, because not only were they sort of overlooked films, and I was able to watch many of them for the first time because they're really hard to find otherwise, but also I saw lots of people talking about them, and in my circles, which admittedly are not the entire United States, but definitely a lot of people having conversations about these very interesting and bizarre and cool films. So I'm hoping that there is a little bit of a renaissance happening.
We hope so too. And thank you again for your writing. We wish you the best for the new novel that's coming out. And we'll post the link to that under the podcast so that people can find your collection of short stories and hear about when the novel will come out.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It was awesome to talk to you guys today.
Thank you for listening to After Images. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and follow After Images podcast on social media.